We now move on to the keynote speakers. The first keynote today is Jennifer Richardson, the Director of Community and Indigenous Supports Branch that houses Ontario's Provincial Anti-Human Trafficking Coordination Office. She oversees the development, implementation, and review of Ontario's response to human trafficking. Jennifer is also known for her research on sexual exploitation and for her innovation in leading partnerships across sectors. I'm delighted to have her multi-year experience as a part of this conference. Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you and good morning. I was very honored to be asked to speak at this conference, and it is my pleasure to be speaking with all of you from the original and unceded lands of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, which we now call Canada. As noted in the introduction, I've been working in the anti-human trafficking space for well over 25 years, but really I've been in what I've written about as the culture of human trafficking since I was 13 years old. And in doing this work and have been trafficked myself, I've had a number of different opportunities to observe what happens to folks when they're being trafficked. And I'll speak to folks from kind of my experience of both being trafficked as a child, but also from the number of different roles that I've had over my career. I've been a frontline worker in child welfare and in community-led programming. I've managed and designed in innovative multi-sectoral police and child welfare intervention and enforcement teams. I've designed specialized curriculum, which is trained all over Canada and has been for about 15 years now. Developed a risk assessment screening tool that can help people identify what stage of trafficking children are in, and led the oversight of 2 different provincial anti-human trafficking coordination offices, but also strategies. As mentioned, I have conducted anti-human trafficking research as well. My thesis was on promising practices on working with trafficked children, and I've also led the legislation to help better protect children who are being trafficked and support survivors. I was also able to launch Canada's first lived experience roundtable, which is in Ontario. And I'm happy to say that I'm still chairing that today, and that table has a large impact on the work that we do in Ontario and how we advance that work. I'm dedicated and passionate about human trafficking, not just because I was trafficked myself, but because I've seen the trauma that traffickers cause to children and people they traffic, and no one should have to experience that type of abuse. I've also watched firsthand the lack of response from a number of different sectors, and I'll speak about child welfare because that's where I spent a good chunk of my career. And to this day, I still see lots of unawareness in child welfare, which actually really breaks my heart, because I think in the last 30 or 40 years, we've all seen that child welfare is a sector where we have a lot of children that are vulnerable to be exploited, but are also recruited to be trafficked. I think I stand with everyone at the conference today as global stewards in the anti-human trafficking sector space. And my hope as well is that we build a safety net that will not only protect children and people from being trafficked, but prevent that. I began my career in Winnipeg, which is a small city in the middle of Canada and in the province of Manitoba. There's about 750,000 people in that city. But Winnipeg has been known as a trafficking hub in Canada for many, many, many years. Manitoba was the first province in Canada to launch a dedicated human trafficking strategy in 2002. And in 2008, I was asked by the province to come to the province to design a specialized team of police and child welfare workers that would work to identify children who are being trafficked through data and mostly missing persons reports to police. That team was also the team that would rapidly locate those children and bring them and return them to safety once they were located, And we're now adopting that model in Ontario, and those units are called care teams, children at risk of exploitation. We know that child exploitation and human trafficking is a human rights abuse as well as child abuse. And I found that typically, though, in training people or working in sectors, that people don't often identify trafficking as child sexual abuse. They often will, identify familial type offenses against children or third-party types of offenses against children. But when they're identifying children who are being trafficked, oftentimes they are still being blamed for that abuse occurring to them. And unfortunately, what that does is lead to then more internalized shame for those children and folks. It really does compound the message that traffickers are beating into people's heads every day, that they chose to be exploited, that they are complicit in the offense, and that they will be treated with scorn and judgment, and that they are not worthy of anyone's protection. That was really why in Manitoba and Ontario, I've worked with my team and our government to look at embedding the legislation of child sexual exploitation or human trafficking into child welfare legislation. And in doing so, in any circumstance where a child is being sexually exploited, that now warrants child welfare involvement, and that can better help kids who are being trafficked in those situations. Leveraging child welfare legislation and having very high offense provisions within child welfare legislation is a promising practice. When I did frontline with the officers that I worked with, I really talked about wanting to use other types of legislation other than the criminal code or federal legislation, because I had not seen a lot of success with that legislation. Still in Canada today, we have less than 25% of our cases receive convictions, and so 75% are not. So for me, I really wanted to look at a different way to deal with this issue. And one of the things that child welfare legislation allowed us to do was to not prove the human trafficking, but we were proving that people were interfering with that child welfare legislation or harboring children. And that was the offense that we were having to prove, which meant it was child welfare workers and police that were giving evidence, not children. Having the ability as well to quickly respond to children once you have identified them to be trafficked and they go missing is a promising practice. We know that every day a child is missing, that they are likely being subjected to sexual abuse by multiple men who are purchasing them for sex, but also by traffickers. So the faster we can get them back to somewhere safe, the more they will be safe, and the less harm that will occur for them. Research has demonstrated in every country as well that chronically missing children are highly connected to trafficking. That's why the Street Reach team in Manitoba and the care units now in Ontario were created with that express purpose of locating and intervening and bringing children who are missing and exploited to safety quickly. And for us in Canada, this work is also very connected to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry and our recommendations. For policy folks in the room today, I really do urge you to embed child exploitation into child sexual abuse legislation, to develop dedicated responses to children who go missing or who have experienced exploitation, and to look at how you can increase those offense provisions. We have seen some success out of those where we're not asking children to also be re-victimized, re-traumatized, to have to repeat what's gone on for them. But like I said, it is the people who are best positioned to protect these children who are the ones that are presenting evidence to the courts. I think the next promising practice that I would talk to you folks about is supporting leadership opportunities for survivors. We know, and again, not just by me saying this, but research has really talked about survivors being the best position to speak to policymakers and politicians and governments about programs and initiatives for survivors. That could mean, creating dedicated positions on boards or within government structures or other governance structures, but as well helping survivors to reach decision-making roles. In many countries across, the world, I've seen folks who are in peer or mentor roles within organizations, but often I do not see survivors in leadership positions. And I would love to see that increase in every country that is dealing with this issue, which is every country in the world. I think leadership for lived experience folks also helps with some of the prior speakers' promising practices as well about reintegrating folks into society and helping them to have healthy and happy lives, but also to contribute to the richness of the programs that they are managing or overseeing. There are a lot of specialized programs that I think I could speak to, having spent, again, most of my life and career in this space. But I would also like to lastly encourage other governments to have demonstrated consistent investments in human trafficking. Many human trafficking programs around the world are not consistently funded, and that creates difficulties for them in helping folks long term. Generally, it does take people 1 to 3 years to recover from being trafficked. The longer they're trafficked, the longer I've seen it take them recover. And so we really do want to ensure that governments are supporting police and child welfare and non-government community organizations to do that work with people and to do that work in a way that's going to best help them reintegrate into society. In Ontario, I am proud of the leadership that the government here has taken with our anti-human trafficking sector. It is the largest in Canada. We have invested $307 million for specialized residential supports for children, for the care teams that I mentioned, for specialized prosecutors, joint task force police teams, along with dedicated funding for Indigenous and community-led supports that are specifically designed for folks who are trafficked. And that, we focus as well on children so that, again, we are intervening further upstream with folks when they are being recruited and brought into this crime. And since the formation of our lived experience roundtable, which does really give us the go-ahead on any of the pieces of our strategy, the legislation, the policy that we make, the educational campaigns that we do, we have really seen, again, a richness in our response. And I would love to share that with other regions so that they could also experience the richness of that response when survivors are put into those positions and able to contribute in that manner. So that wraps up my time. Thank you again for having me. It was great to speak with all of you today.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for sharing your personal and professional experience with us all here, and for highlighting, first of all, the need for investment, which is a crucial piece of the response, for highlighting this unfortunate tendency to view children who've been trafficked differently than children who've been abused, and the need really to incorporate that exploited children under the umbrella of child welfare. And finally, for stressing the importance of empowering survivors in their leadership efforts in the anti-trafficking movement. And here I think it's worth recalling once again the OSC's Survivor Advisory Council launched by ODIHR, which is, I believe, the first and still the only international survivors council, which is a great practice. So thank you very much, Jennifer. Turning now to my next speaker, Kelly Clements, Deputy High Commissioner at UNHCR. She has been closely involved with refugee and displacement issues throughout her 3-decade career, serving in a number of high-level positions, both in the US and abroad. We heard from other speakers about about the concerning humanitarian situation stemming from Ukraine. So we are delighted to hear from UNHCR about what the latest is and how UNHCR is operating, including with regard to risks of trafficking that others have referred to earlier in this program. Kelly, thanks so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Special Representative. Excellencies, delegates, colleagues. Conflict, persecution, generalized violence, and insecurity continue to force millions of people, over 90 million by our last count, to flee their homes in search of safety, and of those, many face conditions of poverty, discrimination, unemployment, and a lack of resources in exile, compelling many to travel further afield in search of opportunities. With challenges for refugees to reach safety and with limited legal means for regular and orderly migration, opportunities for criminal business of traffickers and smugglers are ripe. Amidst tightening visa regimes and border controls, the many barriers imposed by states to legal entry often have unintended consequences, including fueling these very criminal businesses. In many regions, criminal networks control informal transit routes and have both the resources and the contacts to overcome states' deterrent efforts. They charge increasingly high prices to move desperate refugees and often prey on vulnerable people in the process. To illustrate the consequences of this, let me introduce you to Maria, a Nigerian woman who fled deadly fighting in her village with no surviving family, no support network, and no financial resources. The promise of domestic work in Europe was all Maria needed to embark with a ragtag group on a dangerous journey north. The group was ambushed by armed men in the desert and left there to die of hunger and thirst until, for a brief moment, they believed they were saved by strangers. But their respite was short-lived, and Maria was soon subject to savage violence, forced into prostitution for over a year. She was only released when, stricken by illness, she no longer served a purpose for her captors. Then, relying on the goodwill of strangers, she received medical treatment and continued her journey across the sea to Europe with smugglers. This is but one of thousands of testimonies of refugees who have fallen prey to traffickers, and which we have collected through our Telling the Real Story project, a flagship initiative to provide communities with trustworthy information on the risks of such dangerous journeys. This story is unfortunately not unique to Maria or to Nigeria. Sadly, millions of people on the move are at risk of trafficking. In the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, the Tigray region in Ethiopia, Pakistan, Turkey, Lebanon, and countless other countries and regions that host refugees and internally displaced people, weak security and socioeconomic conditions heighten people's vulnerabilities to trafficking. In many conflict and post-conflict settings, the breakdown of public institutions, combined with deteriorating rule of law and extreme violence, often gender-based, provide fertile ground for trafficking in persons. Many, faced with a lack of resources, family, and community support, see no option but to resort to smugglers in search of safety or opportunity, and offer material possessions to traffickers eager to take advantage of people's desperation. For some, as was the case for Maria, this journey begins along the land routes from sub-Saharan Africa to and through North Africa, routes along which abuse, violence, rape, extortion, torture, trafficking for sexual exploitation, or forced labor are all too common. For many, unspeakable brutality begins well before the spotlighted leg of their journey across the seas to reach Europe. Along these routes, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and our partners work tirelessly to identify those who have suffered harm, to map risks and document abuses. These are the important first steps to preventing trafficking and provide protection to those who have already been victimized. The heightened risk faced by displaced women and children in humanitarian crises linked to conflict is well documented. Addressing this risk requires robust victim identification mechanisms along with access to protection and comprehensive aid for survivors. This is why we have redoubled efforts along the routes leading to and across the Mediterranean to provide protection and increase access to third country solutions for refugees, including through evacuations to emergency transit mechanisms in Niger and Rwanda, resettlement, as well as family reunification. Critically, survivors must not be penalized or stigmatized for their involvement in unlawful activities they may have been compelled to engage in. The increasing risk of trafficking in recent years has led UNHCR to reinforce protection for refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, and stateless. Our work with states to address trafficking in persons is adapted to each context. In Ukraine, a senseless war has displaced over 10 million people in recent weeks, 4 million into neighboring countries and 6.5 million internally displaced in Ukraine. Governments, local authorities, and host communities have provided incredible support, and the EU has taken the unprecedented step of activating the Temporary Protection Directive. In spite of this outpouring of solidarity, the huge displacement caused by war in what has become the fastest growing refugee crisis since the Second World War increases the risks of trafficking, gender-based violence, and sexual exploitation and abuse for refugees fleeing Ukraine. Risks are great for women and children, and they represent 90% of those fleeing the conflict. Unaccompanied and separated children, including those who used to live in care institutions in Ukraine, are especially vulnerable. Anecdotal information about persons approaching refugees at border crossings, in reception facilities, and other locations with dubious or too good to believe promises of work, free accommodation, or transportation points to clear risks that women, boys, and girls may fall prey to unscrupulous individuals or well-established criminal networks. This occurs especially where there is no systematic vetting and registration systems in place for volunteers and organizations supporting refugees. Echoing these concerns, Europol recently warned that Ukrainian refugees are at risk of sexual and labor exploitation and forced criminality at different stages of their flight, not only in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. And while news of the first identified cases of trafficking are trickling in, we remain acutely aware of the extreme challenges faced by both law enforcement and humanitarian actors to identify such cases. To respond to these risks, UNHCR and our partners are stepping up and tailoring prevention efforts immediately, including through the Stay Safe campaign. Together with UNICEF, we are setting up Blue Dots, which are information and support hubs at strategic locations such as border crossings, at train and bus stations, and reception centers. These provide safe spaces for refugees to receive information, counseling, and protection services. We're also advocating for vetting and registration arrangements for those who provide accommodation or transport to help refugees seeking help, and that they are not exposed to exploitation at the hands of criminal actors, and that any abuse or misuse can be reported to appropriate authorities and perpetrators are held to account. We are cooperating and coordinating closely with key anti-trafficking partners, including UN agencies, notably IOM, UNODC, and UNICEF, and European partners, including the EU Anti-Trafficking Coordinator and, of course, OSCE, as well as civil society organizations. Within UNHCR's regional refugee response, we are working to establish a task force on anti-trafficking to support states and civil society anti-trafficking efforts. In receiving countries, we plan to support and scale up national referral mechanisms to identify, assist, and protect victims of trafficking, step up targeted prevention among the refugee population, and respond to cases in a manner that is both gender and age sensitive and responds to trauma. Our work in other crises informs our response, and efforts to mainstream and embed anti-trafficking action from the outset is part of our humanitarian work. The Global Protection Cluster's Anti-Trafficking Task Team, co-led by UNHCR and IOM, is fostering an information exchange, coordination, and mainstreaming of anti-trafficking action within the protection response in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is on everyone's mind, but we cannot forget that millions of others also face the dramatic consequences of conflict. People in Ethiopia, Yemen, Burkina Faso, Myanmar, and other countries across the globe continue to suffer. And poverty, inequality, injustice, discrimination, all root causes of trafficking in persons, are a reality for millions of refugees across the globe, and often for the communities who so generously host them. To address these long-term challenges, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, complements life-saving protection and aid with efforts to promote the social inclusion of refugees into their host communities. We are building a more comprehensive model of response with a broader coalition of development and other partners at the international, national, and local levels to address the immediate and longer-term needs of refugees and host communities. When people have access to safety and opportunity, and when solutions are real, they become more resilient and self-reliant. facilitating access to labor markets and other forms of livelihoods for forcibly displaced, and removing barriers to their inclusion promotes their participation and contribution to host communities. Faced with this, traffickers can no longer capitalize on vulnerabilities to lure refugees into fraudulent and abusive travel and employment arrangements. But these are longer-term efforts. In the short term, we must improve our collective capacity to screen populations, to identify survivors of trafficking, and to establish referral pathways for aid and protection. It is challenging work, there's no doubt about it, given the clandestine nature of trafficking and the fact that survivors rarely self-identify. Yet when good cooperation and coordination exists between all relevant actors, including asylum authorities, we do far better in survivor protection and support. Before closing, allow me to return this to the story of Maria. In her case, as in others, we have a responsibility to ensure persons who fear persecution in their country of origin, either because of circumstances of their departure or because of a fear of being trafficked, are afforded international protection. We must consider the consequences Maria and other survivors of trafficking would face if returned to their country, and where relevant, consider non-refoulement obligations under the 1951 Convention in International Human Rights Law. To conclude, let me outline 3 recommendations for you for your consideration and discussion in the coming days. First, while states retain the right to regulate entry into their territories, mitigating trafficking risks and providing adequate protection to victims of trafficking requires them to adopt protection-sensitive entry systems and meet the commitment outlined in both the global compacts on refugees and for migration to strengthen legal pathways for refugees and migrants. Second, we call on states to end the impunity of traffickers and ensure better aid and protection for survivors, regardless of their willingness or capacity to cooperate with authorities. This includes identification of international protection needs of survivors and persons at risk of trafficking to ensure that their access to asylum procedures and durable solutions, including, where appropriate, in the form of third country resettlement. And finally, it is critical that all of us, civil society, states, multilateral institutions, make or redouble efforts to address the drivers of conflict and persistent root causes of displacement and trafficking, violence, poverty, inequality, and injustice. Because, to quote the UN Secretary-General, for predators and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy, it's an opportunity, and women and children are the targets. Thank you for your attention and concerted action.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for that informative and stark reminder of the need to address vulnerabilities, not tomorrow or not in a month, but really right now. Traffickers are out there trying to exploit those vulnerabilities. Risks are very high, as we heard, and it's our obligation to act now to prevent further harm to people who already went through a great deal of suffering. Thank you also for the recommendations, including your emphasis on vetting, which I know some countries are already engaged in, registration and screening, very, very practical and useful thoughts as we move forward. I now move to the last of our keynote speakers, Dr. Najat Maala Majid, Special Representative of the UN Secretary-General on Violence Against Children. Over the last 3 decades, she has devoted her life to the promotion and protection of children's rights and worked with many governments and NGOs on the development of national policies on the protection of the child. Najad, when we first contemplated an Alliance Conference on Protection, I think you were the very first name that came to our minds as being a speaker. Trafficking in children has been on the rise for years, and almost everywhere I go, I hear governments increasingly worried about an epidemic of child trafficking. So it's a real pleasure to have you here to share your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Al. It's really my pleasure to be here today. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, dear friends, really it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. And I want first to express my profound gratitude and respect for OSCE work. For a long time, OSCE has been at the forefront to end trafficking, and this gathering comes at a crossroad and critical moment. However, Despite all the work that has been undertaken over the last 2 decades by various key stakeholders, states, OECD, UN, regional organizations, civil society, and many others, trafficking in children continues to be a high profit, low risk crime based upon the principle of supply and demand. And it was highlighted by the previous speaker. The trafficking in children market is an endless vicious cycle fostered by 3 key factors that we need to keep in mind. First, the increasing vulnerability of children worldwide due to various and interlinked factors. 2, growing local and global demand for child labor, child sexual exploitation, child illegal adoption, child enrollment in criminal or armed groups, among others. And third, growing and increasingly organized, clandestine and lucrative criminal activity underpinned by evolving technologies and cryptocurrencies. The urgency for an effective protection and assistance to trafficking victims, including children who are undoubtedly among the most vulnerable and unprotected, is evident. Reflections on our successes and failures to effectively protect victims of human trafficking are therefore more relevant than ever. I would like to stress 4 key messages today. First, despite our collective efforts, the scale of child trafficking remains an overwhelming concern, as children account nearly 1/3 of all identified victims. As a result of the socio-economic impact of the pandemic and ongoing humanitarian crisis due to wars, but due also to climate change, more children fell into poverty with increased vulnerabilities to become victims of trafficking. Widespread violence, armed conflicts, food insecurity, and environment degradation have reached such levels that we are witnessing an unprecedented level of mass human movement around the globe. More than 33 million children worldwide had been forcibly displaced by the end of 2020. Children who account for less than 1/3 of the global population account for almost half of the world's refugees. Many of those on the move are children, girls and boys under the age of 18, many of whom are unaccompanied, compelled to leave their homes and communities to flee violence or oppression or to seek safety and protection elsewhere. The protection of children from risks of trafficking and exploitation in migratory flows is therefore of paramount importance. In Europe, in just a few weeks, 2 million children have been forced to flee life-threatening attacks on their homes, schools, and communities in Ukraine, with an additional 2.5 million children displaced within country. We cannot also forget massive forced migration flows in other countries affected by wars such as Syria, Myanmar, Yemen, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and the Sahel region, among others. And we cannot forget that millions of children are still living since many years in camps, and they are facing a high risk of trafficking. Forced displacements heighten the risk of trafficking, and the most vulnerable among the displaced are children unaccompanied and separated, children left without parental care, with disabilities, children living in institutions, in foster homes or state care. They all are most likely to be targeted and exploited by traffickers and go missing along these dangerous journeys, as highlighted by Jennifer. Second message, the ongoing forced displacement has overwhelmed and revealed gaps in national child protection systems to rapidly and effectively respond to the specific needs and vulnerabilities of children. Lack of identification and referral of victims of trafficking is a prevailing problem. In many countries, immigration and border control authorities, who are the first point of contact for children on the move, are not sufficiently linked to child protection agencies. They often fail to provide sustainable protection to child victims of trafficking and are not aware or trained to prevent double victimization. In many cases, children who are in search of a safe haven lack access to a child protection authority, to a rights-based age and gender-sensitive determination process, to legal representation, to accessible information about their rights, or about ways of seeking redress for the acts of violence they may have suffered along their journeys. Too often, they are denied opportunities for family tracing and reunification and access to justice for the safeguard of their rights as victims of trafficking. Children who often lack documentation are perceived as intruders, detained, and treated as criminals, while they are in desperate need of protection. Due to their age, fear of arrest, deportation, or retaliation from criminals, they are less likely to report abuse to authorities in transit and destination countries. As a result, they may not be able to benefit from the protection they are entitled to as children and as victims of trafficking. Third message, we cannot miss the opportunity for a people and child-centered collective and duly coordinated action. There are a number of critical issues that we need to address to protect children amid migratory flows from risks of trafficking and exploitation. First, immediate protection and response measures to reduce children's vulnerability to trafficking must include provision of information in languages people seeking refuge understand on available support services, including housing, health and childcare, identity documents, and temporary residence permits, shelters, hotlines, family preservation, and reunification, among others. Rapid exchange of information and enhanced cross-border cooperation for proper registration and tracking of children who seek refuge, as well as volunteers receiving them to prevent children going missing. Child-friendly border management, including well-trained staff and referral mechanisms to timely identify and refer unaccompanied or separated children to child protection services and specialists. Non-discriminatory protection of all children and their caregiver, addressing racism and xenophobia. Second, in medium and longer term, states need to provide durable solutions and strengthen their national child protection systems and basic services, including education, health and mental health, social protection, housing, psychosocial support, justice, legal counsel and representation to make them accessible to all displaced children without discrimination. Strengthen national capacities for timely identification, referral, and protection of child victims of trafficking. This requires strengthening national referral mechanisms, multi-sectoral, cross-border, and transnational cooperation. States must end practice of immigration detention of children, as it is never in the best interest of a child, and ensure practical implementation of non-punishment principle for acts committed by children as a consequence of their trafficking. Ensure accountability for the perpetrators through improved capabilities for criminal investigation and mutual legal assistance. This requires, among other, better use of ICTs to disrupt traffickers who are increasingly using technologies and other developments such as cryptocurrencies to expand their business of trafficking. Ensure that measures to address trafficking tackle not only supply but also demand, and sustain investment in child protection beyond the emergency phase. The recommendation of the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings on the need to enhance anti-trafficking prevention amid mass migration flows provide a clear guidance on concrete steps that need to be taken, and I strongly encourage participating government to take measures to ensure their implementation. My fourth and last message: protecting children cannot wait because of the huge human and economic costs paid by children and societies. Children are paying a heavy toll. They are treated like commodities, which are bought, sold, traded, and used over and over again. They are experiencing mental health issues that will have a long-lasting impact. Child victims of trafficking may not reach their full education and health potential, which will limit their future income and productivity and impact human capital development. So we need to act jointly, faster and better for and with children. Less than 8 years remain to keep our promise on ending all forms of violence against children, including trafficking. Based on learnings from the ongoing and previous experiences, we need a paradigm shift. To this end, we must move away from siloed and unsustainable approaches. Our vision and action must be broad, based on a child rights, life cycle, and cross-sectoral approach, ensuring complementarity between humanitarian, security, and people-centered development. We must strengthen and scale up national and cross-border, cross-sectoral systems involving child protection services, national anti-trafficking coordinators, and law enforcement agencies to ensure child protection and safety and to hold traffickers accountable. We must see spending on this integrated cross-sectoral system as a key investment to protect duly and sustainably children from violence and trafficking. This calls for strong political will translated into sufficient financial resources, well-staffed services and social workforce, effective coordination, information sharing, monitoring, as well as accountability mechanisms. And most importantly, as Jennifer highlighted, we need to ensure that all actions to address child trafficking are informed and shaped by children's experiences, as they know best where the system has failed them the most. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Najad. What a powerful way to wrap up our opening session. Thank you so much for highlighting these important points, the worrying scale of the problem, the persisting gaps in national child protection systems, and for sharing your powerful and important recommendations. Thank you so much. This concludes our opening session, and I'm delighted to share with you that we are on time, even a bit early, which means you get to experience the joys of in-person dialogue a little bit longer at the break. But we will now take a break. And for those in the room or in the Western or Central Europe, we will be back at 4 p.m. in about 40 minutes. And for those online, please do not interrupt your connection to the Zoom call to avoid disruptions. For everyone who is on Twitter, this might be a good moment for you to join the conversation online and ask questions. Once again, the hashtags are CTHB22 or Ask OSCE. Thank you all. We will see you at 4 p.m.